in the I Care for Your Brain lecture series. What we're going to be talking about today is how substances affect the older adult uniquely. What we're going to do is go through the 4 most common substances that older adults take. This includes prescription medications, over-the-counter supplements, diet, and alcohol. Why is this topic important? Older adults disproportionately take more medications, more substances into their body than any other age group. As we get older, we are prescribed more and more medications, which increases the risk of adverse events. Older adults are 2 to 7 times more likely to go to the emergency room due to an unintended event related to a prescription medication or a supplement. This is concerning because a large group of older adults take supplements, as many as 60%. And most importantly, this is a modifiable risk factor. This is one of those things that if we knew more about it, we would have a lot more power and control to do something about it and minimize the risk factor. As we get older, there are unique changes in the body and the brain's ability to absorb, metabolize, process, and excrete substances. So let me tell you a little bit about why that is. There's a variety of changes that happen in the physiology of the older adult that come together to uniquely affect the way they process substances. This can include less muscle mass, less water in the body, decreased functioning in the liver and the kidneys, a decrease in blood flow. All of this prolongs the drug half-life in our body and increases our sensitivity to the effects of the drug. An important concept to this understanding is the blood-brain barrier, which is an interlocking system of cells that restricts the ability of substances to flow directly into the brain. As we get older, the tightness of the junction of this interlocking connection of cells gets a little bit looser, more freely allowing substances to get direct access into the brain. Furthermore, chronic illnesses that are more and more common as we age, like diabetes, high blood pressure, hypertension, change the way that substances are processed in the body, specifically in the kidneys and the liver. One thing that's really important to remember is how participants are chosen for the highest level of scientific evidence when it comes to medications, double-blind placebo clinical trials. What these scientists try to do is find older adults who are as uncomplicated medically as possible so they can look at the most direct effects of that substance on an individual. But how many older adults do we really know that only have one condition? The problem is that this does not represent the majority of older adults. Most people have more than one medical condition, and many older adults take multiple medications. And the truth is that no scientific studies have really been done that help us understand when you put all of these different factors into a pot, what is it exactly that's happening? The bottom line here that I want you to know is that it's basically unknown. We really don't have a good understanding of how multiple different medications combined with over-the-counters, combined with herbs, combined with alcohol and medicines and food, how they specifically affect older adults. What we're going to talk about now is prescription medications, but we have to enter this part of our conversation with a little bit of a warning. I'm going to say this multiple times in this series. You have to remember that I'm a neuropsychologist. I'm not a trained physician, and by rights, I really can't give you detailed advice on what to do in terms of medications, but I do feel comfortable giving you some general guidelines. I don't want you to make any drastic decisions about your medications without consulting with your primary care physician. Please don't stop or start any medications based on anything you hear in this lecture series. It's really important to get the advice of a trusted medical professional. Weighing the risks and benefits of different medications is a challenge, and a physician has to understand you specifically to understand what's in your best interest. Now, this fact cuts across all ages. Prescription medications are on the rise. More and more every year when you check the statistics, we see the amount of prescriptions that are being offered to people increase year after year. One of the biggest concerns that I have with prescription medications is related to too many cooks in the kitchen. One of the best things that's happened to medicine in the last few years is that we do have incredible specialists who are really experts in a specific aspect of your health. The problem is that we almost have too narrow of a focus on the individual. This is part of what I love about neuropsychology, is that we're trying to bring together the whole person to understand how brain-related changes affect the entire person, a complex person with a rich personal and social history. Sometimes what can happen when you have too many specialists involved with your medical care is that the left arm might not know what the right arm is doing. This is why it's so important to use the same pharmacy and make sure that you have at least one person on your medical team who knows exactly all the prescriptions that are being prescribed. The more medications and supplements you take, the more likelihood it is that you're going to have an unintended interaction effect. I want you to take a look at this slide that came out in 2006 from a study by Ferner and Aronson. What you have on the bottom part of the slide is the number of medications that a given participant was taking. What you have on the long axis is the number of possible interactions that can happen. The different colors of the curved lines represents the number of interactions that can happen, and it goes from two-way to three-way to four-way interactions. So if we assume that most older adults are taking anywhere from 8 to 10 medications, look how many possible interactions that we can have with all of these medications, going up to as high as 200. Now I want to talk to you about some specific prescription medications that are particularly concerning for the older adult. The first one that we're going to talk about are opioid pain medications. In the past 20 years, opioid prescriptions in the United States have increased by more than 600%. Now, this is concerning to older adult advocates because older adults much more commonly complain of chronic pain. It's estimated that anywhere between 25 and 50% of older adults meet criteria for a chronic pain syndrome. Older adults who happen to live in a nursing facility have an even higher amount of chronic pain, estimated to be anywhere from 50 to 70%. Opioids are mostly processed and excreted in the kidneys. Now, many adults have a low level of chronic kidney disease, but they aren't even aware of it. Next time you go to the doctor or you bring someone to the doctor that you care about, be sure to ask them what the degree of kidney disease is in that person. Be sure to ask your physician to go over the specifics for that person. What is their known level of kidney disease? One of the things that we worry about most with older adults taking these medications is that they represent a dramatic increase in the risk of a traumatic fall. The risk of fracture in the humerus, which is the bone in the upper arm, was 9 times greater when older adults were taking these opioids. The risk of fracture to the hip was 3 times greater. Complications of hip fracture are a leading cause of death, particularly in older women. Up to half of older adults that are hospitalized for hip fracture never return to their previous level of functioning. Many people are prescribed opioid pain medications after a traumatic fall. The problem is that these medications can delay or prevent a full recovery and increase the risk of long-term disability. Another concern is the cognitive effects that happen due to opioid pain medications in older adults. Multiple studies have shown that over time, these medications hurt memory. This is particularly concerning for older adults who have any kind of a pulmonary condition, like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, or sleep apnea. The reason why is that opioids slow down the breathing process, and this is something that people with those two medical conditions are already struggling with. This results in a decrease in oxygen levels, and you already know that oxygen is one of the 2 primary fuels that the brain needs in order to function. Now we're going to talk about benzodiazepines. These are primarily used for anxiety and sleep problems in older adults. They're usually intended for a short-term duration because over time they can be habit-forming, but I know that many older adults were prescribed them once upon a time, and the prescription has just gone on and on into the future without anyone necessarily really thinking it through. It's very clear from the scientific literature that whether or not someone uses these medications in the short term or in the long term, they absolutely increase falls, fractures, and motor vehicle accidents. The risk of hip fracture is greatest within the first 2 weeks of therapy with these benzodiazepine medications, increasing with higher and higher doses, and particularly if any other similar drugs that act on the central nervous system are added. Research in 2014 suggested that the use of benzodiazepines is a huge factor in why so many older adults wind up in the emergency room. And again, this takes us back to things like falling and breaking a bone. What are the cognitive effects of these medications? How do they affect thinking and information processing? Well, we've known for a very long time that just one dose of these medications makes people feel a little bit foggy mentally. What we didn't know, though, until recently is that long-term use of these medications is a unique risk factor for dementia. And recent research suggests that the more and more you use these medications, the higher this risk gets. A good guideline for thinking about the usage of benzodiazepines is that it seems to be around after 3 or 4 months of use that we're going to see the biggest cognitive effects. But this is also complicated. Like most things in science, it's not as easy as, well, just don't use those medications, because there's some times in people's lives where they absolutely need to use them. And that if we don't treat the medical conditions that these prescriptions are prescribed for, those conditions, like insomnia, like anxiety, can have their own cognitive side effects. So again, it's complicated, and you really need to consult with your personal physician about your unique situation. The American Geriatric Society came out with a recommendation last year that encouraged physicians to not use benzodiazepines as their first choice in treating these conditions in older adults. Despite these contradictions that are known in the scientific literature, older adults are disproportionately prescribed these medications. If we look at the change in prescriptions over time from 2008 to 2015, we find some pretty scary information. Across all age groups, we know that long-term use is increasing. If you look at adults that are 18 to 35 years old, what we found from that time period of 2008 to 2015 is that the numbers of prescriptions increased from 2.6% to 14.7%. But I want you to listen to the numbers in older adults. Over that same time period, we went from 8.7% to almost 32%. Benzodiazepine use is almost twice as common in women as it is in men. A lot of older adult advocates, including myself, feel that these medications are too commonly prescribed. However, you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. In many instances, however, there are safer alternatives. It's just that people don't know about them. And when we get to the recommendation part of this lecture, I'm going to teach you all about them. Now we're going to talk about over-the-counter supplements. What we don't want to forget is that these are also drugs, and sometimes they can be even more powerful than the drugs that we get by prescription. Healthcare advocates tell us that over-the-counter medications are an effective way of shifting a greater share of healthcare costs back on the consumer. Currently, there are over 100,000 over-the-counter medications that are available on the market. Why is this the case? Adults over the age of 65 account for the biggest group of buyers of these over-the-counter medications and account for over 40% of the sales. Research tells us that most older adults actually take twice as many over-the-counter medications as they do prescription drugs. So it's really important how we understand how these substances affect the aging brain. The problem with over-the-counter medications is that we don't take their use seriously. It's very easy to forget that the Food and Drug Administration does not regulate the use of over-the-counter medications. They don't have any scientific burden of proof. This next class of medications you're going to hear me talk about a few times in this lecture series because it's that important. These are the anticholinergic medications. And how I want you to think about them is that they do the exact opposite of what the memory-enhancing medications that are on the market do. About 50% of adults over the age of 65 take at least one of these medications, and many take multiple medications with an effect that's either mild all the way up to severe. There are more than 600 different drugs that can be considered to be anticholinergic. These medications occur in almost every drug class, but we see them more commonly in antidepressants, sleep medications, and anti-urinary urgency medications. They're also present in many over-the-counter drugs like Benadryl or any type of sleep aid with a PM at the end of the name. And what we know about anticholinergic drugs is that the more you take, the greater the symptoms. The effect of these medications happens at every cell in the body, but what we care about is how this affects the brain. Essentially what it does is it blocks a chemical messenger called acetylcholine from getting from one cell to the other. This interrupts communication between brain cells, which is the essence of how we think and process information. I want you to know about the symptoms of a high number of anticholinergic medications in the older adult, so that way you can know if you yourself are going through this or someone that you care about. The way that I think about it is that it kind of dries up all the systems. People get dry eyes, they talk about having a hard time urinating, and in a way you can also think of it as kind of drying out the brain. Now really that's just a metaphor, but what I want you to get from it is that it slows down processing, and like I just said, it makes it harder for cells to communicate with each other. The biggest effect that we see is on memory and attention. Other symptoms include blurred vision, heat intolerance, and sleepiness. The risk for cognitive impairment in one study from 2013 was increased as high as 50% in adults who had at least 3 of these medications that were considered to be of mild severity. This happened when the older adults were taking them for more than 90 days. When you got into some of the stronger medications, what they found was that in 100% of people, there was cognitive impairment symptoms when people were taking these medications for more than 60 days. After about 7 years, older adults who had a high anticholinergic score were more than 4 times likely to develop symptoms of dementia. That's why it's critical that you understand how many of your prescription medications and how many over-the-counter medications have this anticholinergic property. If you go through your workbook, I'm going to give you a checklist where you can calculate the exact number that's personalized to you or somebody that you care about. Within older adults, we get especially concerned for anyone that is already having cognitive symptoms when they take these medications. So maybe someone who's just starting to show the very early, mild stages of dementia. Their brains seem to be particularly vulnerable to the effects of anticholinergics. Now we're going to talk about supplements. Cutting across all age groups, about 1 in 55 hospital admissions is related to an unintended interaction between an herbal or over-the-counter supplement and a prescription drug. We have very little scientific information about the relationship between supplements, over-the-counter drugs, and prescription medications. What we're going to do now is take a look at 3 common supplements and 1 memory product that's currently on the market. We're going to be talking about coconut oil, turmeric, melatonin, and Prevagen. According to a 2016 AARP study, more than 60% of older adults take at least 1 supplement. The first one we're going to talk about is coconut oil. At the time that I'm recording this brain series, I would say that this is the most popular supplement that claims to positively affect brain health. Now, I've seen claims cut across all different levels. Some that just promise to keep your brain as healthy as it is, other ones that have promises to even reverse things like Alzheimer's disease. Proponents of coconut oil say that it's rich in medium-chain triglycerides, which are more readily metabolized than other types of fats and break down into ketones that are used by the brain as what they consider to be a secondary fuel. As of 2017, there was no coconut-based product that was approved by the Federal Drug Administration to treat any type of brain condition. In 2017, the most comprehensive critical review yet of curcumin, the active ingredient in turmeric, found no evidence of any specific therapeutic benefits, despite thousands of research papers and more than 120 clinical trials. The author of the study concluded that findings were often hyped up and incorrectly translated in the media, and that no double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial of curcumin has been successful. Next, we're going to talk about melatonin. Melatonin is actually made in all of the cells in the body, but particularly so in a part of the brain called the pineal gland. The production and release of melatonin occurs during the circadian rhythm, with its peak coming at night. There is supporting evidence that melatonin actually works, but there's some things you need to know about it in order to get as much benefit as possible. When we talk about melatonin, it's essential to make sure that we understand the effect of blue light. So what do I mean when I say blue light? Blue light is the wavelength of light that gets emanated from screens, particularly things like our smartphones, our iPads, and our televisions. What happens is that the pineal gland in the brain interprets this stimuli as if it was sunlight. It then affects the circadian rhythm, and our bodies think that it's sun rays and that it's time to get up. When our brain is exposed to blue light, what happens is that the melatonin gets suppressed, and our brain thinks that it's time to wake up and start our day. When we get to the recommendations part of the lecture, I'm going to tell you all about exactly how you should be considering taking melatonin. Now we're going to talk about Prevagen, probably the most common over-the-counter supplement on the market that is supposed to help with memory. At the time of this taping, they had accumulated almost $165 million in sales, and I have a lot of patients that I know take this. The active ingredient is a protein derived from jellyfish, and the idea is that it improves memory and reduces age-related cognitive impairment. 30 pills can cost anywhere from $24 to $68, depending on where you live. But there's something about this over-the-counter drug that I bet you've never heard before. In January 2017, something very important came out in the news. The headline was that the Federal Trade Commission in New York charged the marketers of Prevagen with making false and unsubstantiated claims about memory. I want to tell you about a quote that was offered by the New York Attorney General. He said the marketing of this supplement was a clear-cut fraud, from the label on the bottle to the ads that were airing all across the country. He said that it was particularly unacceptable that this company had targeted vulnerable citizens like seniors in its advertising for a product that costs more than a week's groceries, but provides none of the health benefits that it claims. Now, ultimately, this is going to be decided in a federal district court, but I think it's important for you to know that people who are in charge of public health have concerns about the scientific basis of these very popular supplements. When we're thinking about the health of older adults, particularly how it relates to substances, it's really important that we talk about our next topic, alcohol. Alcohol is the most commonly used substance in adults over the age of 65. Over the age of 60, 53% of men and 30% of women say that they drink on a pretty regular basis. If you were to read the scientific literature about alcohol in the older adult, the theme that comes up time and time again is something called at-risk drinking. And I want to tell you how this is defined. The definition of at-risk drinking is more than 7 drinks per week or more than 3 drinks in one sitting for adults over the age of 60. And what these scientists think is that at-risk drinking poses a much more significant risk to older adults than something like full-blown alcohol disorders, like alcohol abuse or dependency. At-risk drinking is much more common. What's important is that older adults and people that care about them know that there's probably a new limit for us as we reach the age of about 60. It's really important to understand that our ability to process alcohol does change with age. If you give a younger and older adult the same amount of alcohol and test their blood, what you're going to find is that older adults do have a higher concentration of blood alcohol. They're also going to have more cognitive impairment as it relates to the acute effects of the alcohol. So that means how exactly the alcohol is affecting them immediately after drinking it is more significant in the older adult. At-risk drinking can trigger or exacerbate multiple types of health conditions in older adults. It can increase the risk of hypertension, cardiac arrhythmia, myocardial infarction, and cardiomyopathy, all serious heart conditions. It can increase the risk of hemorrhagic stroke. These are the types of strokes that happen when we get a bursted blood vessel. They impair the immune system and our capacity to fight infection. Too much alcohol can decrease bone density. It can cause gastrointestinal bleeding and lead to mental health problems like depression or anxiety, probably because it's a rather poor coping skill. It can worsen hearing and vision loss. Of course, we also have to think about how alcohol interfaces with other prescription drugs and over-the-counter supplements. This is a field of research that's underdeveloped at the present time. We really don't have a clear understanding of how all of these substances come together. Now, that being said, we know that mixing alcohol with other substances is dangerous. Both prescription and over-the-counter medications, especially pain medications, benzodiazepines, anti-seizure medications, and antidepressants, are particularly dangerous. In a survey of over 83,000 older adults, almost 20% of them were taking a medication that was known to negatively interact with alcohol. And they also reported drinking on a regular basis. So let's talk about exactly how alcohol affects the brain. The first thing that you need to consider is that alcohol is considered a toxic substance. In the short term, a part of the brain called the cerebellum is particularly vulnerable to the effects of alcohol. More specifically, it's a type of cell called a Purkinje cell that's in the cerebellum that's really sensitive to the effects of alcohol. We also know that the memory parts of the brain and the emotional centers of the brain are particularly affected when people are drinking. We know that heavy alcohol consumption, particularly after a period of about 20 years, shrinks the entire brain and specifically the cerebellum and those memory centers. People who have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, particularly those who carry a genetic variant called the ApoE4 gene, are particularly vulnerable to the risks of too much alcohol. What we know is that people who have this gene, who drink any alcohol, are 3 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's than non-drinking carriers. And carriers do not show the benefit from light drinking that people who don't have the genes for Alzheimer's show. When thinking about cognitive functioning in alcohol, the effects are what we call a J-shaped curve. And what we see is that at light to moderate use, there can be some benefits. And why we think this is the case is because we're opening up those blood vessels and getting more blood and oxygen pumping throughout the body, including the brain. But what happens when you get too much alcohol is that there's more damage than benefit. Let's talk about alcohol-related dementia. Now, this is one of those 90 subtypes of dementia that we talked about a few lectures back. And people who are at risk for this type of dementia have a history of moderate to high drinking. So I would say that this is more than between 4 and 5 drinks per day for a period of about 20 years. Research studies have shown in men over the age of 65 that they have about a 5 times increased risk chance of developing dementia if they have a history of heavy drinking. Now, here's the good news about alcohol. Longer periods of sobriety are very, very good for the brain. There's even some research that suggests that the longer you're sober, you're actually able to reverse some of the damage that's been caused by long-term intensive drinking. So what I want you to hear from that is that it's really never too late to stop. After a person stops drinking, what you see is a gradual improvement in their cognitive functioning over time. At first, there may be withdrawal symptoms, particularly if someone was a very heavy drinker, but over the weeks and months of not drinking, you're going to find that the person is more clear, they're more able to focus on what you're saying, and they're more able to learn and remember new information. What we think is that it takes about several months to a year to get the full benefits of abstinence. What can be difficult, though, about encouraging someone to reduce their drinking or even stop their drinking when you're worried about them is that the acute effects of alcohol on the brain make it harder for these people to make good decisions. The part of the brain that's involved with reasoning, being able to see consequences down the road and being able to hold back on our impulses is the exact part of the brain that's affected by alcohol. So please don't have these important conversations with someone when they're under the influence. So now we're going to transition into the recommendations. I want to put you in charge and help you understand exactly what it is that you need to do to reduce the risk factors that we just talked about. So what I want you to do now is open up your companion workbook, and we're going to go through these together one by one. The first recommendation that I have for you is it's very important to take stock of exactly what's going on now. So I want you to make a comprehensive list of every single substance that you put into your body above and beyond food. I want your physicians and the people that care about you to know exactly what it is you're putting into your body. So please make a list of all your prescription medications, any supplements that you might take, and any over-the-counter medications that you're currently taking. What I want you to do is bring this list to your primary care physician and go over it with them in detail. This can be something that you ask for every time you go to the doctor, or at least do it once a year. Anytime you're prescribed a new medication, I want you to be proactive. I want you to ask exactly what is this medication for? What are the risks and the benefits? And how does this interact with all the other things that I'm taking? Remember that taking more than 6 medications increases your risk of an adverse event by up to 4 times. Ideally, your primary care doctor should really sign off on all the medications that you take. Each additional prescriber that we have making medication recommendations increases our risk of an adverse related drug event by 30% according to research. I always want you to use the same pharmacist, and I want you to use a pill box every single day. What we get worried about is, of course, people forgetting to take their medications, but doubling and even tripling up on medications is actually more dangerous. One good rule of thumb is to start low and go slow. Try not to add in more than 1 medication at a time. Now, that being said, of course, there's times when your physicians are going to have you take more than 1 medication at a time. But what I want you to do is ask questions about this. Become more actively involved in the healthcare decisions that affect you and your body and your brain. What's good about starting a medication just on its own is that you're going to have a much clearer sense of any side effects that are happening. If you start 2 medications at a time, it can be really hard to tease apart which one of those is actually giving you the problem. It then makes it harder to make good decisions about how to go forward. I want you to be aware of something called the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. These are really interesting psychological concepts that basically tell us that our expectations about what a certain medication is going to do for us is very likely to come true. You've probably heard of the placebo effect. And basically that comes from research designs in which one group gets an experimental medication and the other group gets a sham medication, typically something like a sugar pill. What we find is that people who are taking the sham medication or the sugar pill sometimes get the exact same benefits of the people taking the actual drug. And why we think this is the power of the placebo effect. If you think something is going to positively affect you and you really, really believe it, chances are you can start to see some of those benefits. Equally as true is the nocebo effect, and this is a much less known psychological phenomenon, but it's just as true. If you expect that a medication is not going to have any positive effect, or further, if it's actually going to hurt you, chances are you're going to experience side effects. So once again, we have to get really clear on what our thoughts are telling us. We want to make sure that we're approaching our medications knowing that they're going to help us. If you start to take a medication and you feel negatively about it, and every day when you go to take that pill, you tell yourself something bad, I don't think you're going to get to experience all the benefits of the medication because the negative expectations that you bring with you are going to affect your experience. I'm going to insist that you find out your anticholinergic burden score. If you look in the companion workbook, you're going to find all the tools that you need to figure this out. You can also go to a website called agingbraincare.org to get really good resources on this topic. The next recommendation involves alcohol. I want you to look at this slide again and look at the specific amounts of alcohol that are recommended for adults over the age of about 60 to 65. Very recently, the guidelines were updated from the American Geriatric Society and the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And what they recommended for older adults is that they drink no more than 3 standard drinks per day and no more than 7 per week. This is especially important if you have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. It's really important to know that if you have a dependency on alcohol, and despite your best efforts to cut down, if you can't do it on your own, there are great resources out there, and it's up to you to talk to your primary physician about connecting you to them. The next recommendation has to do with supplements. I really want you to put these substances in their proper place. Now, here's my bottom line. If the risks and the costs are low, I would say go ahead and try it and see maybe it's going to work for you. If a product is expensive, or you've heard from other people or you've learned from this brain health series that there may be possible risks, I'm going to recommend that you don't try it. This is an industry that is not regulated. We have a tendency to think that more of something is better, and that if something is quote unquote natural, it must be good for us. But this is just not the case. Substances are not regulated in the same way that prescription drugs are, and they may very well pose a safety risk to you or somebody that you care about. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recently came out and said that while older adults do need to pay attention to getting the right amount of vitamins and nutrients, what they really want is for older adults to get these things from their diets and not supplements or vitamins. Now, of course, this is good advice, except if you have something like a doctor-diagnosed vitamin deficiency, like vitamin B12, vitamin D, or an iron-related problem like anemia. Remember that one of the types of medications that poses the biggest risk to older adults is opioids? I want to talk to you a little bit about different ideas for managing your pain without the use of medications. There's a specialty field within psychology called pain psychology, and what these experts do is they try to figure out ways that we can think and process our pain differently. And I want to teach you some of the tips that they have to share with us. One of the most important things that you can do is increase your circulation. Now, of course, exercise is a great way and probably the best way to do this, but you can also use things like ice pack and massage to start moving the blood around your body more. Now, this is a really interesting finding, and we've seen it in multiple research studies. What scientists think is that acetaminophen is actually the most powerful pain-reducing medication and is even as powerful as opioid pain medications. The problem is that we don't think of it that way. This gets back to the idea of how we think about things really affects our experience of things. So what I want you to do is understand that acetaminophen is a powerful medication to help you with pain, but you're not going to see the big profile of risks that you do with the opioid pain medications. But like many things in life, we also do have a downside to the overuse of acetaminophen, and this is liver damage. This is particularly the case if you're one of those people that does enjoy those 2 glasses of alcohol that you're now going to be enjoying. Pain psychologists also use techniques known as cognitive behavioral strategies to help older adults reduce the effect of pain on their everyday life. One of the most important things is to not give all of your attention over to pain. Now, of course, this is very hard because the purpose of pain is to draw our attention to it so that way we can solve the underlying problem and stay safe and healthy. This is very important. And I really want you to pay attention to your body's messages, particularly for a sudden or very serious pain. But once you've had a good workup by a doctor and you know the cause of your pain, let's just say it's related to osteoarthritis, a very common form of chronic pain in older adults. The key challenge is to not let it consume you, to not let it be at the center of your life, to not have it be your most common topic of conversation. What can happen when you do that is it can actually increase the experience in pain. what we pay attention to, we experience more dramatically. So it's really important as best you can to try to make sure that you're making room for other things in your life, not just the chronic pain. Remember earlier we talked about the negative effects that can happen from using those benzodiazepines for anxiety, particularly over a long period of time? Well, psychologists know that there's a lot of non-drug related treatments that are related to anxiety, specifically those cognitive behavioral strategies and also relaxation therapy. If you listen to the lecture that I have on stress, we're going to talk a lot about positive coping skills, and what they involve is directly confronting the problem and not avoiding it. When you look in your companion workbook, I want you to look at the deep breathing exercises that we've laid out for you. The power of breath cannot be overstated. It can absolutely help you manage anxiety better. So much of what happens in the anxious body is that we start to breathe more and more shallow, and of course, over time, what happens? This just increases our anxiety even more. Deep breathing is a built-in tool you can take with you anywhere. And once you learn how to master this aspect of your well-being, you're going to feel a lot more in charge of your anxiety, and you might not feel that you need a medication in order to calm yourself down. In addition, it's really important to talk about your feelings. A lot of anxiety can be related to not expressing ourselves, to holding back things that we really feel because we don't think that we have a right to feel them, and we're afraid about what people close to us are going to think about us if we do express ourselves. Now, if these things don't work, I'd like you to really consider going to a professional for support as opposed to just using a medication. Now, like I said before, there's plenty of times where people are truly distressed by anxiety, and I've seen it many times as a psychologist. And I absolutely am not recommending that no one ever use these medications at a given time. The truth is, though, that they're probably overprescribed, and we want to make sure that we're also offering people non-drug related treatments to help reduce their anxiety so they don't have to rely on those medications. I taught you earlier that one class of drugs that is particularly harmful for the brains of older adults are those anticholinergics, particularly over-the-counter sleep medications. If you look in your workbook, I have a very detailed list of activities that I want you to start to do tonight that are scientifically proven to help improve your sleep. We think of these as 6 pillars that are essential for sleep. I'm not going to go over them in detail with you right now because it's in your workbook. Before you consider a medication to help you with sleep, there's 2 things that I want you to try first. The first one is that I want you to make your bedroom a screen-free zone for at least the hour before you want to go to sleep. Remember, what that blue light does to your brain is it gives it a message that it's time to wake up, and we want to be giving our brain the exact opposite message. We want the brain to think that it's time to relax and get a deep night's sleep. The next thing I want you to do is start practicing something called sleep hygiene. This is a series of daytime behaviors that you can do that will encourage your brain to wind down and get a good night's sleep instead of tossing and turning all night long. We could do a whole lecture on sleep hygiene, so what I've chosen to do is in your workbook, I've boiled it down to the 6 most essential points, and I want you to review that today once we're done with the lecture. Now, I promised earlier to talk to you about melatonin and the best way to use melatonin according to the scientific literature. This is a perfect example of thinking that more is always better. The scientific studies have suggested that less melatonin is actually more effective. When you go to the grocery store or the drugstore and you try to buy melatonin, what you're going to see is that it typically comes in 5 or 10 milligram bottles. Most people go for the 10 milligrams because they feel like, well, hey, if 5's going to help me, well, 10 should help me a whole lot more. The exact opposite is true with melatonin. And what the research shows is that the lowest possible dose, 1 milligram, is actually the most effective. Now, you're probably going to have to find those 1 milligram tablets online. They're not readily available. And that's probably because most people don't think that they're going to be as effective. It's probably the case that less is more when it comes to melatonin because this is more closely related to the levels that are naturally in our body. Our body naturally produces about 0.3 milligrams of melatonin per day. So if we're loading up on 10 milligrams, that's really out of proportion to what our brain and our body is used to. The sustained release tablets are thought to be even better than the regular tablets. But again, because melatonin is not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, we do have concerns that perhaps all the melatonin on the market is not pure. One of the ways that scientists think about getting around this is actually using ones that are based using synthetic ingredients. Now that might go counter to your idea of wanting to use a supplement that's all natural, but what you want to get is the most steady, reliable source of melatonin in your body. And brain scientists think that you're going to get that through more of the synthetic versions. The idea is that you want to take melatonin in that 1 milligram tablet about an hour before bedtime. And the final recommendation takes us back to our old friend exercise. I'm going to say this time and time again in our time together. Cardiovascular exercise is the #1 scientifically based recommendation to help with brain health. Remember earlier I said that one of the problems is we don't have as much muscle mass in our body, that we carry less water, and that our kidneys and our liver don't work as well as we get older? Well, guess what? Exercise helps you reverse some of that. In addition, one of the benefits of exercise is that it increases our circulation, and this allows for a more efficient processing and excreting of all substances in the body. It also increases muscle mass, which allows us to hold more water in the body. When we're more hydrated, we're able to, again, process these substances more efficiently. So that concludes our recommendations for today. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me. I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture. Thank you so much for being with me.